Agathe Bauer's one-way dialogue. My earliest memory of Agathe Bauer is from my childhood, from around the time when my drawings didn't resemble modernist art anymore, but also hadn't yet started to look like failed attempts to depict an ideal world in a realistic way. I definitely hadn't yet been taught how to visually represent three-dimensional space, and this was also years before I was able to draw hands. Most likely this memory was formed in the year of the collapse of the state, the year before school, but there's no way to find out whether or not that's the truth. I only know that one night I was lying in bed and I heard the voice of Agathe Bauer talk to me from the inside of my ears. I knew she wasn't actually there. I knew her voice was just in my head, yet undeniably she was speaking to me, and this was not the only time. Here she was again, speaking and explaining. As always, I didn't reply. I listened as I would listen to unknown adults, to audio plays, or to people on television. Now, the problem was that Agathe Bauer didn't mean well. I could tell from the way she was speaking that she was here to talk me into something. Not so much in the sense of persuasion, but more in the sense of forcing me to understand something. How does a person force another person to understand? Let's say A wants to transfer a package of information to B without B having requested it. If the dialogue is taking place between living people in real space and time, the easiest way for A to make B understand anything is for A to be already trusted by B due to an existing relationship. Family tie, friendship, comradeship, which is currently untroubled by personal conflict. What if there's no such relationship between A and B? If society isn't currently going through a revolutionary process, A will likely be understood by B if A is older or more confident than B, or if A is positioned above B, either by institutional position or by locally relevant social binaries like gender, race, class, sexuality, ability, religion, political affiliation, popularity, visual appeal, etc. Unfortunately, it is nearly impossible to acquire these privileges spontaneously. What does A do in the case of their failing to fulfill all or some of these criteria, but when they still desire to pass a package of information over to B without B having requested it? A very common strategy of spontaneous one-way communication is physical or symbolic aggression. To make up for missing trust or missing authority, A might try to communicate in an aggressive or arrogant tone of voice, mock or verbally insult B or threaten B with moral punishment, for example in the afterlife, in order to forcefully transmit their information. All of these approaches, however, are very risky, because as much as they may successfully humiliate B and may force them to listen to A out of fear, they may also destroy any remaining or potential trust. And trust is definitely the most helpful companion on the long and complex road towards making oneself understood. Other strategies may be less risky, more secretive, or more complex, and are more difficult to explain. To strategically switch between giving and withdrawing affection is commonly practiced among caregivers. Although this can be very frustrating and painful for B, it doesn't seem to disrupt trust as much as open aggression does. It certainly does leave negative feelings, stored in randomly assigned places in B's body and accessible only to fictitious creatures and ghosts, so it is risky in another way. However, the consequences for A might be delayed by years, even decades. The least risky and most long-term oriented strategy is for A to do nothing but listen to B speak, consistently creating a space for B to develop trust, and eventually, years later, when the right time has come, A may just carefully hint at something and B can immediately understand what A is saying, even if it is not at all in B's interests to do so. Obviously, this approach requires a lot of skill and patience and may not be suitable for everyone. The latter strategy is one I have only just recently discovered in a book about ancient Chinese political diplomacy. Reading about a classical text attributed to Gui Guzi, I was surprised to learn that trust could be treated not as a fragile and authentic social tie, but as a tool of strategic emotional manipulation. Now, did Agathe Bauer use one of these strategies? It is difficult to describe and even harder to remember what it was about her one-way dialogue that made me resist its symbolic flow of information. There's a German proverb, wer nicht hören will, muss fühlen. One who does not want to hear must feel. It was an omnipresent proverb during those dreamy years around the collapse of the state. Cited by all kinds of adults and repeated by the kids, it said, if trust does not make one obey another, another will use other methods to make one feel their power. Could it be that it wasn't Agathe Bauer who had bad intentions, but only my childish refusal to hear that made this voice seem threatening? That made it seem so physical and sensual in a horrific way? Agathe Bauer did not have a body. She was clearly just a voice, and she didn't even sound like a human being. Her voice was distorted, as if it was being transmitted through an electronic device. She was speaking and I was listening. In this way, the relationship was obvious and clear. Yet on a symbolic level, nothing was clear between us. Agathe Bauer and I were playing an excruciating game. Her tone indicated she had power over me and that she had a lot of information to pass on. But even though I think I tried, there was no way to understand what she was saying. The words were rushing, falling forward, and the sentences were formulated in such an indirect way that it was impossible for me to get the message. Sometimes it was impossible to grasp anything at all. Did she actually speak the same language as me? Why would I have a voice in my head that speaks in an unintelligible language? Her voice was powerful in a sick way, not in a pleasant way. And it was vibrating all over me, from my guts to my brain and back again, and somehow it contained zero symbolic information. Sometimes it felt like she threatened me with punishment, but I didn't understand what that punishment would be. I felt that she had knowledge that I didn't possess, and somehow she refused to disclose it to me, or I was stubbornly resisting to hear. All is well that starts well, and what never starts will never end. Years later, I reconnected with Agathe Bauer in a club called Arbeitskreis für Jenseitskontakte, Working Group for Contacts to the Beyond, where we were making recordings for an experimental radio play. I didn't actually meet her physically. Agathe Bauer doesn't have a body, but I noticed how we reconnected on another plane. The working group met every 2 weeks in the cellar of a villa in Berlin-Zehlendorf to search the waves between radio channels for messages of loved ones or other important people who weren't alive anymore. In the beginning, they met in facilities associated with the Catholic Church, but since the Church doesn't officially approve of Spiritism or any technique that enables people to make contact with dead relatives, they eventually were asked to meet elsewhere. The head of the club was Michael, a retired patrol cop who had spent most of his professional life communicating through the police radio. Some of the other members had worked in telecommunications back in the day. Another was a retired miner and factory worker. During a regular meeting, they would sit around a table. The ex-cop would turn the knob of the radio looking for a suitable noise. And when he had found one, the group would try to distinguish intelligible words, names, and sentences. Everyone had their own ghosts to talk to, so normally they were simply listening and recording for some time until one would say, "I heard something." And in case it wasn't clear right away what the voices had said and which one of them had been speaking to, and which of them they had been speaking to, the cop would take the recording home, cut it into pieces, and run it through quality-reducing converters in order to remove distracting remnants of actual human voices. And if this wasn't enough, he would also try to play it backwards. At the next meeting, he would present and explain his findings, aided by a subtitled audio-video presentation. When my project partner and I returned to the second round of our oracle, Michael gave us a presentation such as this, and throughout the evening we all got a chance to laugh quite a bit, because Spiritism can be a very joyful religious practice. At the same time, I experienced a gentle yet very uncanny mixture of nausea and mental pain. The policeman's edit of our ghost recording sounded shockingly similar to the unforgotten memory of Agathe Bauer's voice. Guided by the conceptual framework of our radio project, we had agreed beforehand to attribute all of the ghost recordings to the voice of Joan of Arc, a voice-hearing warrior and the Catholic patron saint of the radio, and to the voice of Nikola Tesla, a pigeon-loving loner and the official inventor of radio technology. At the recording session, each of us had turned to one of these two historical figures with a personal question, and in the final radio play, we were going to weave the results into a bigger narrative about these characters, associating them with all kinds of written texts, improvised dialogue, and music. So, when I was sitting around the table with the people of Arbeitskreis für Jenseitskontakte, I had open ears, ready to listen and to make sound recordings, but I wouldn't say I was interested in re-experiencing the nauseous presence of my childhood spectre. Yet there she was again, speaking and not making sense. Listening to her voice 25 years after we first connected still didn't result in her getting her message across to me. This time, however, I was not alone, and to my great relief, I noticed that our relationship has changed. I could have used this rare chance to listen to my haunted voice on repeat, with the goal to dissect its content and to properly analyze it with the help of experts like Michael. But actually, I already had a better plan for her nonsense. Me and my collaborator were equipped with a narrative framework that already included a presence of meaningless voices, a very open framework where any sound could be framed, named, and linked to a story, even a sound that in itself was completely meaningless. So in the very moment of our adult reconnection, Agatha Power and I missed each other again. It wasn't her this time who claimed to speak, while I silently resisted to hear. There was no need for me to insist on the meaninglessness of her authoritative laments and hideous explanations. Our roles had swapped, and it was Agatha Power now who insisted on unintelligibility, on being made out of fragments, while I assumed the right to freely interpret her, to integrate her into a story that was at least partly made up. I had come here to listen, to appropriate ghosts, and luckily I had grown unable to hear anything that didn't already make sense to me.